Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Premiership Quarter. Today, I'm going to be doing my round 9 tips for the AFL season. I'm going to be going through every game, talking about a bit where I think the game might be won and lost, and I'll also be talking a little bit about how I went in the last round, which I'll do now and get that underway. So, I tipped Crows by 11, and they ended up winning by 30, which is a good tip. I tipped Collingwood by 13, and they just scraped past Carlton by 6 points. Tipped GWS to win by 8, and I got that pretty wrong. Sydney were able to get a really strong performance and win by 5 goals. I tipped the Saints by 24 points and said that it's a must-win game for them. Ended up winning by just over 6 goals. I tipped Geelong to beat Melbourne in a close game where I thought it was going to be a very low-scoring game. Went a bit too high with my 82 to 77 prediction, but Melbourne ended up winning by 8 points. I tipped the Bombers to beat West Coast in a decently close game by 14. They ended up winning by 6. I tipped Dogs by 20. They really should have won that game and they lost by 7. And I tipped Gold Coast by 12 in an upset, and they were really, really poor against Brisbane Lions. So I ended up getting 5 out of 9, which is not great. And it just sort of keeps me level with a lot of other people, so I couldn't able to get one over. With that being said, let's get straight into the round 9 tips. On the Thursday night, we have Carlton versus Melbourne. Carlton coming off an okay performance against Collingwood, where they were just unable to get the win, losing by 6 points to a Nick Dacos winner with about a minute and a half left. They haven't looked as defensively solid as they had been for the back half of last year, but that's also due to a few injuries. No McGovern. They didn't have Brady Kemp playing on the weekend. I think that was just due to drops. No Adam Sard. And so they haven't been able to be as good as they were at the back end of last year to really propel them into the top 4 race right at the end of the year. And then their forward line also hasn't really worked outside of Mackay and Curnow. Mackay kicked 4 goals, I think is third in the Coleman at the moment, and Curnow, I think, kicked 2. But outside of that, his aerial presence wasn't as felt as it had been throughout the year, and that means his ground ball work, which isn't his strong suit, looked a little bit weak, and he looked almost disinterested at times, which is unfair. I don't think he was disinterested. It's just not his strength. And I think that they really need to get their forward line going. That's going to be tough coming against a very, very solid defensive team like Melbourne. Melbourne coming off a very good win against Geelong, where they're able to get the win by 8 points, as I mentioned earlier. Their forward line has struggled quite a bit so far this year, where they have been very inaccurate. They've taken some really difficult shots, and then their smalls haven't necessarily been as impactful as what they might be. Pickett hasn't been able to find that consistency that he normally does have. Cade Chandler hasn't been at the top form that we might be able to see him in the future. But outside of that, their midfield was pretty good. Clayton Oliver was back at his best against a Dangerfieldless Geelong midfield. Max Gawn was superb. And then their backline with May, Lever, and McDonald as the 3 key pillars has been performing really, really well. Lever being great, and then McDonald having that defensive role on Jezza, potentially going to Curnow now as well this week. He'll have a really, really tough game, but I think he can stand up as he did against Cameron. It's a different matchup. And so maybe they do go with someone else. Maybe they do go May on him and then put McDonald on Mackay, but it'll be very interesting. I think the game will probably be one based off of accuracy in this game. It's something Carlton has struggled with at times, and something obviously Melbourne has struggled with against Geelong, but have also been known to, especially in the back half of the year. I think whoever kicks more accurately will probably win the game. Who do I back to do that, though? I really don't know. I think it's a bit of a toss of the coin, whoever does kick more accurately. But I think the more likely team to do it would be Melbourne. They normally do it better in the first half of the year than they do in the second half. And the form that Max Gawn's in at the moment, I think that the clearance work Carlton normally get from Pitternet won't be at the level he has done so far in the past 3 or 4 games. And I think that Clayton Oliver getting back into form will also propel the Melbourne midfield to potentially getting over the top of the Carlton midfield at the moment, which isn't perfect because they're missing a couple plays that would provide a better balance than what they normally are getting. So I think Melbourne probably get the win by about 2 goals. We then have Geelong versus Port Adelaide at Cardinia Park. Geelong coming off a tough loss against Melbourne, and Port Adelaide coming off a showdown loss to Adelaide. Geelong have been excellent to start the year. Obviously 7-0 before the loss against Melbourne, now 7-1. And then Port Adelaide doing their normal self, beating the poor teams and then struggling against the better teams, even though Adelaide is not necessarily a top 4 or top 8 fancy at the moment. They've still struggled to play them over the last few years. Adelaide have really had the edge over them. And without a lead, their backline was really, really poor and were able to get scored on a bit too easily at times. Um, it's going to be a very interesting battle. It's going to be second versus seventh, and there's going to be no Dangerfield, and so also no Rosie. So it's going to be an interesting midfield battle. The two ruckmans are going to be interesting as well. Is it going to be Stanley? Is it going to be Conway? Is it going to be Soldo? Is it going to be Sweet? None of them have really solidified their spot so far this year. Soldo and Stanley have probably been the more solid options, but Sweet and Conway a bit more athletic and a bit more aerial strength wise. And so it's going to be interesting there. It's going to be interesting again with Geelong's forward line. Are they going to rest Tom Hawkins? Are they going to go with the younger Shannon Neal? Is Port Adelaide's forward line going to get a rest with Charlie Dixon? They're going to want to risk that against a really solid Geelong team. It's going to be a very interesting tactical battle because Geelong have been able to change so many things and Port Adelaide were on to play one way. It's also going to be interesting to see how that goes at GMHBA Stadium. I think Geelong probably do get the win. I think that their system has been backed in by Chris Scott and he's able to make a couple tactical changes here and there at maybe half time to be able to get a strength over their opponent. And I think Jezza Cameron, with a poor game last week against Melbourne, is probably in line to have a ripper against Port Adelaide. It's going to be played on the Friday, and Geelong probably should get the win, even though their midfield might be at a bit of a risk this week, same as last week, probably by about 15 points, I'd say. We then have Fremantle versus Sydney on the Friday night. Fremantle coming off a very good win, their biggest at the MCG since I believe 2015 against Richmond. They were really, really strong throughout the game. And then Sydney coming off a great win against GWS. It's going to be a very interesting battle between these two teams. Sydney are probably in the better form at the moment, but you can't discount Fremantle at home. It's going to be Brodie Grundy against both Darcy and Jackson, which could probably be the difference in the game. You'd also assume that Fife will be elevated from the sub back into the starting midfield. And that could be a very interesting battle. You've got Warner, you've got Heaney at the moment, Goulden, Mills, not Mills, Adams, Jordan, Rowbottom. So against Sarong, Brayshaw, Fife, Young, some really, really good plays in there, and that'll be a very interesting battle as well. I think Fremantle's forward line might struggle against a pretty solid Sydney backline, but also Fremantle's backline is just as strong against a very even spread in the Sydney forward line. So it's going to be a very, very interesting battle. I think Sydney are probably going to be the slight favourite, but definitely don't discount Fremantle in this matchup. But Sydney are probably the slightly year or two ahead of Fremantle at the moment, and I think they have some more options, especially going forward. Fremantle are going to be set up and be defensively solid, but just I don't know if they're going to be able to control this Sydney attacking outfit, given they do so well as a whole. So with that being said, I think Sydney get the win by just over 3 goals. Next, we have Hawthorn versus St Kilda, down, I believe, in Tasmania. Hawthorn coming off, again, a really good win against the Western Bulldogs by 7 points. St Kilda coming off a 38-point win against North Melbourne. Hawthorn were able to get a great win without Mitch Lewis, without Mabior Chol, without Luke Breust, I believe, against a very poor Bulldogs outfit. James Sicily was in the absolute battles, but was still able to push through, and he kicked a good goal after being moved forward. Cal Shadir had a good moment where he was able to kick a couple goals as well, replacing essentially not a couple players up forward for Hawthorn because they were forced to. And then for St Kilda, they were able to get a good win against North Melbourne. Their midfield looked a bit better. Steele had a good game. Sinclair was back to his absolute best. Darcy Wilson was excellent on the wing, having over 20 touches and kicking 3 goals too. Outside of that, there's not too much to say about St Kilda other than necessarily Jack Hayes, who was really good on return. Sorry, not debut, on return. But Max King struggled, so he might need to have a big game. But I don't know who's going to win this because Hawthorn normally do play well against St Kilda. It is also down in Tasmania, and so that could be a factor. It'll be a really, really interesting battle. But for St Kilda to make finals, I think this is a must win. They're going to need to be defensively solid. I don't know if Hawthorn will get either Lewis or Chol back for this game. But if they don't, I think St Kilda should lock Hawthorn up. Even with Hawthorn's good small forwards, there shouldn't be a chance they score over 80 points against a much more defensively solid team like St Kilda compared to the Bulldogs. And then St Kilda's forward line will need to be able to hold up, and their midfield will really need to get on top. It'll be interesting to see how well Rowan Marshall plays because he hasn't been at his absolute best like he was last year to start the season. But I think with that said, St Kilda should get the win by just over 20 points. I'm not biased in this, by the way. We then have Essendon versus GWS. Essendon getting a good 6-point win against West Coast, who performed relatively well. And then GWS coming off a 5-goal loss to Sydney, where they were just out-battered essentially by Sydney. I wasn't able to catch the game, which I didn't mention before. But it's a battle between 4th and 5th, so very interesting. It's going to be at Marvel Stadium as well, which you could theoretically make an argument helps Essendon. They're going to be under the roof. But I think GWS are definitely the more experienced team. I think their midfield will be without Tom Green, which is going to be tough for them to handle. But look at someone like Finn Callahan to have one of his best games. They're going to need Callan Ward and Stephen Cornelio, which I don't think is back actually. So they're going to need Josh Kelly. They're going to need maybe Lockie Whitfield to play a bit more there, Lockie Ash potentially. They're going to need someone to stand up in the midfield. And look to potentially see Zach Merritt take advantage of that. Kieran Briggs, I think, probably needs to step up a little, especially against two rucks in what might be Goldstein and Draper. But I think that defensively, GWS should get the job done against Essendon's forwards, and that should keep them in the game. But I think it'll be close, and they'll get the win by 8 points. We then have Richmond versus the Western Bulldogs at the MCG. Richmond coming off a disappointing loss by 54 points to Fremantle, and the Bulldogs also coming off a disappointing loss against Hawthorn. It's been a real struggle for Richmond this season, dealing with a lot of injuries. They were able to get Jaden Short back, but at the loss of Jacob Hopper, which is a bit frustrating. And they've just really not been able to get any consistency. Without Bolton playing at his best, they struggle to find evenness in games. They can't find ways to score consistently. And it's going to be a really tough first year for Adam Uze. And then the Bulldogs just really can't find any consistency in their game either. Defensively, they looked poor against a Hawthorn team with no Lewis, with no Chol, with no Bruce. And then up forward, they just can't find any rhythm between Norton, Ugelhagen, Lobb, or Darcy. They just seem to play better with one of them not playing there, and they need to find a solution to that. They're going to be without Liberatore as well, which is why I think this will be a closer game. I also think Bolton, they're not going to have the right matchup for him, and so I think he might play a bit exciting at the MCG, and I think that it'll be close, but I think the Bulldogs need to get this win by 14 points. We then have Gold Coast versus North Melbourne. Gold Coast coming off a disappointing performance against Brisbane, and North doing the same against St Kilda. North started 0-8, still the only winless team in the competition at the moment. And then Gold Coast, I think, are winless away from home as well. And I think this is at home as well at Marara Oval. So with that, it should be a win for Gold Coast, and I do think they'll get it. Jared Witts had a down game compared to his game against West Coast, and I think he can replicate that against Tristan Cherry. I think their midfield should be able to get back on top, and their forward line should really get going, and they should score over 100 points, and they'll get the win by about just 5 goals-ish. We then have on the Sunday, Collingwood versus West Coast. Collingwood coming off a good win against Carlton, and West Coast coming off a decent performance against Essendon. They're going to be going head-to-head at Marvel Stadium, and Collingwood should definitely get the win in this. They're going to be without Mitchell again, without De Goey again, without Schultz. I don't think he's suspension will get overturned at all, and also without Myercheck. So it's going to be a really challenging game for them to try win against what has been a better performing West Coast team when fully fit. They're going to be without Yo for this week, so their midfield's not going to be at its absolute best, and that's where I have Collingwood winning it, because I think their midfield will get really, really going, and they'll win it by 26 points. We then have Adelaide versus Brisbane in what could be a very interesting game as well. It's two teams that have not started the season well, but in the last few weeks have gotten back into form. Brisbane coming off a very good win against Gold Coast, but they've got a lot of injuries now. And then Adelaide coming off a very good win against Port Adelaide in the showdown. Adelaide didn't perform great. They probably weren't statistically the better team. They were much more efficient against Port Adelaide. And then Brisbane were able to get out to a really strong lead in the first half, and then essentially just sort of kept their lead, kept Gold Coast at bay with plays going down here and there, which is really, really unfortunate for them to be able to try get their season going. Whether I think the game will be won and lost, honestly, this game could be decided by forward efficiency and accuracy. Adelaide have not been perfect at that this year, and Brisbane obviously weren't very good against doing that against Gold Coast. And if Adelaide can get their forward line going in Adelaide, I think they're every chance to win this game. And without McCarthy, without Ainsworth, and without Gardiner, I think Brisbane are going to be very fragile, and they could very easily lose, which I have them doing by 9 points. But that's going to be the end of this video. If you enjoyed, please hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content. Leave your thoughts about who might win in the comments below, and thanks for watching.